I've been developing a retro horror game for 2 years now, and it's finally nearly finished. My name is Shmungus, and this is my game, Never Forgotten. It's a 2D survival horror game in which you take the role of the learned soul who explores a dying world engulfed in flesh. You'll encounter a variety of different puzzles and face monstrous creatures in a real-time turn-based combat system inspired by the likes of Everhood and Undertale. Your journey through this world will be wrought with misery, though you must see to it that you overcome that which looms over your subconscious. If the game looks interesting to you, please consider heading over to the Steam page and wishlisting it. That'd be greatly appreciated, thanks. In this video, I'm going to share the work I've done this past week, which includes art and music, as well as go over my journey making this game and sharing some advice for other game developers tackling larger projects like this. This last week, I've managed to close out polish on the last levels of the game. I needed to finish visuals, music, dialogue, and more. Before I got into the art, I first drew up some basic concepts for me to reference when drawing. I go through this process in which I first recreate the reference unshaded, then I go in and add that finer detail and shading. Aside from having to do more enemy art, I also had to do the largest sprite for the game yet, coming in at a whopping 1,248 pixels by 1,248 pixels is the flesh dome. The process to make this sprite was like any other. I took a reference image to base the drawing off of, and then I got to work sketching it out. The first thing I needed to do was get the scale right, which with large pieces like this can be incredibly difficult, just given all the numbers I need to keep track of, like how many squares wide or how tall is this section, etc. Once I got the shape and scale done, I went in and added an additional detail and shading. An important thing to note is that I didn't meticulously shade this whole thing like I would any other sprite in the game, and that's just because it would take a very long time, and more importantly, it looks good enough, so I moved on. Here's the final result in the game. The idea, of course, is to give a real sense of scale. The camera is panned back the farthest it's ever been, to the point where you can barely even see the player. Given I was finishing up the game, I needed artwork for one of the final cutscenes, which included a shot of hands. Given hands are an abomination and incredibly difficult to draw, I sought a different method for getting the shot I needed. I took pictures of my hands doing the right poses I needed against the black background on my sketchbook. I then brought those images into Sprite, erased most of the background, and keeping the hand relatively intact. I then shrank the hand way down, then erased where fingers would intersect, and then I just made the whole thing wider than it already was and added some shading. I'm quite happy with how it turned out. I mean, it ended up working way better than I thought it did, and the process itself was pretty fun, and I'm probably going to try something like this in the future with another cutscene that I need to do, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now with the music I made, I'm not going to go too in depth with what I made this week, mostly because a lot of it isn't super interesting since it just involves simple tracks that make use of leitmotifs. For a lot of the tracks, I just used a piano with some heavy reverb on it. The idea was just to get the music in the game where it was needed, and then I can replace it later with better tracks when I have the time. Just like in a game jam, if you could put any sound effects in your game whatsoever, you should, because music, sound, and ambience add so much to your game's world, atmosphere, and feel. So despite the songs being rushed, they do deliver on the emotional necessities which they need to, as well as filling out the space in the level. Which anyways, talking about rushed this, rushed that is actually not a bad segue into the next segment. Though I'm getting a tad too ahead of myself, so let's just ease into it. As I've pointed out, I've been working on this game for 2 years, and when you consider how much time I spent writing about this game and even previous iterations, that number starts to go even higher. Never Forgotten is a game that has formed from several different ideas I've had over the years and deciding to combine them together, cutting what didn't work along the way. Believe it or not, Never Forgotten used to be a colorful platformer with a quirky cast of characters, yet despite the stark difference in visuals and turn, Never Forgotten as it is now has still carried over concepts from that original story, such as the idea of the world being corrupted, and your goal in the story is to confront that corruption, which of course has metaphorical implications. With my journey and the rough development cycle I've had for the game, I thought it would be worthwhile to share some advice I've gathered from my own experiences making a game for this long. Alright, so to begin, let's start with the obvious. I should have planned this game out from the get-go. Now here's the thing, I didn't need a super detailed plan, just something basic to give me a start, as in general concepts for gameplay mechanics, the turn of the game, and what my goals were. The biggest issue that I had when I didn't have a plan is that I ended up working on things sort of at random. Like I just had an idea for a mechanic and decided to just put it in the game. What I didn't consider when doing that is how well it would complement everything else I've built, And if it doesn't work, well, now all that time I spent adding that thing that I didn't need to add is kind of wasted, and I'll have to either remove it or go down a rabbit hole of attempting to patch it and make everything else now work to accommodate it. When I have a general plan, I can spend time working towards the goals I set with a clearer path ahead of me. Doesn't mean that there won't be failed mechanics or second guessing myself along the way, just that I'm minimizing the fluff which can bog down development, sometimes even to a quitting point. When I got deep into development for the current version of Never Forgotten, I decided to set aside some time for the sake of writing out a general plan and some notes. From there, I would reference those notes when I would design the levels on paper and then adapt those designs in engine. That's how I managed to complete the first act of the game, but I realized that even this was still a tad too unorganized. I had a general plan for the direction which the game would go in, but given how narratively focused it was, I found myself still cutting and redoing a lot of early content because I was still figuring out the story and needed specific details in order to design these early areas, which I hadn't thought out yet. So, after I released the next Fest demo, the next thing I set myself to do, after responding to some feedback, was write the rest of the game. Now, this was an incredibly daunting task, and I didn't even know where to begin, but the thing is, I just needed to take it in steps. I first just laid out a general plan, just a basic few sentence description for what was going to happen in each chapter of the game, in which there were 9 total. 3 of those were already finished. Once I had that general plan, I then went through and fleshed out each chapter, adding in far more detail and references to things in the level itself, which I could reference when drawing up the levels. So after the story was written, I designed all the levels on paper, which includes every enemy, puzzle, item placement, and even how each section of the level should be framed. One thing though, how did I know what I was making was fun or good? And I mean, the truth is, I didn't, I still don't, but the thing is that the designs for these levels were built off of what I've already made, which were designs which were proven to work. In other words, I had a good idea for what made for a good level in my game, since I've been sculpting the first 3 levels of the game around playtesting feedback for months, so now I kinda have an idea of where to start when making a puzzle and how to make it intuitive. I have an idea where to start when, building an enemy, what sort of attacks it should have, and the difficulty curve leading up to it. Also, in response to all that playtesting feedback is the fact that I needed to place way more health items throughout the level since players were struggling a lot in that first act, which is just another thing that's now kind of like a staple of the level design. It's something that I'm actively thinking about when I'm drawing up these levels, how many health items there are, where are they placed, stuff like that. So, once the levels were all planned, I prototyped each in-game until I was done with that act, which made up 3 levels each. Then I would move on to the next act and do the same thing. This process was certainly quite tedious at times, but it worked relatively efficiently since I was in a consistent and familiar workflow for long periods of time. Prototyping first also helped with making any adjustments I needed to, since I was just using blocked out assets. So if I wanted to make a change to, a solution to a puzzle or the layout of a room, it took very minimal effort. So where I'm at now is that the game's finished content-wise, all I'm doing is adding polish and refining what I've got. The point of everything I've talked about so far is to highlight how I never would have been able to finish the game in the past 4 months, which, yes, all of the new content for the game has been finished over the past 4 months. I wouldn't have been able to have done that so quickly without the planning beforehand. I was able to iterate quickly through on-paper designs and prototyping and minimize the amount of second-guessing I would have done otherwise. I didn't need to think when I was creating content for the game, I just had to create according to my plan and make adjustments where I saw it fit. By separating the part where I'm being super creative and coming up with ideas and the part where I'm just making stuff, it makes each more efficient since they're more focused. That being said, you still end up having to use creativity sometimes when you're still designing new content. For example, when I'm making enemy designs, I'll draw up a sketch on paper, through several designs, and then I'll have my more detailed sketch, which I'll then adapt that into the actual sprite itself. But even when I'm making that sprite, I'm still making new decisions. Like I'm thinking, okay, maybe this thing here could be slightly different, or, I'm gonna add a little bit of extra detail here that wasn't present in the concept because, minor stuff like that you're kind of thinking up to the very last minute. That's still a part of the creating process, but that shouldn't be, it shouldn't take up a moderate chunk of it or even like a big chunk. It should take up a very small amount. So what I'm trying to say in regards to this is that you need to get the majority of the thinking out of the way first before you can actually start creating. You don't have to per se, but I've personally found this to be a very efficient method for making this game and sticking with it. Now, of course, planning isn't the end-all be-all. It's great for efficiency, but early on when I was figuring out the gameplay, a useful tip I found was just to take from other games. It's commonplace for games to combine different mechanical inspirations in order to create something familiar yet still fresh. I can't emphasize how important it is to look to other games for this mechanical inspiration, specifically because you already have a reference for how it's supposed to look and work. The combat in my game is a very simple combination of Everhood's lane-based movement with the bullet hell aspects from Undertale's combat system. I was able to understand what was necessary for this system by simply looking at those titles and seeing what they did. Looking at Everhood, the movement felt snappy and responsive due to how quick the movement itself is, along with the smearing on the player character when they move. Of course, complemented by the sound effect as well. The way the battle system was structured was lifted directly from Undertale. You choose to attack or use an item, follow up your attack with a timing minigame to maximize damage, then transition to a bullet hell minigame where you need to avoid taking damage before repeating. Taking strong inspirations in regards to the gameplay from these two titles helped me understand what I needed to do not only to make it feel good to play, but also how the battle system should work from a fundamental standpoint, considering battle systems like this can be very complex to write. So the main takeaway: look at what other games like yours are doing, try and understand what makes them enjoyable to play, and adapt that to your own title. It's really useful to use another game's gameplay as a benchmark for what you're aiming for, since you get that instant feedback for what you're missing or could be doing better. Of course, when it comes to problem solving in regards to game design, you can't rely solely on referencing other game systems as a solution. Along the way, you will need to develop creative thinking skills which can combat hiccups you'll run into when putting these systems into action. In my experience, the absolute most important piece of advice I can give to anyone working on a big project is learning to say good enough. Game development is an incredibly time-consuming and taxing art to create completely solo, and I've had many battles against perfectionism and honing in on stuff which didn't really matter in the grand scheme of whatever I was creating. A lot of people tend to get burnt out while working on games for months at a time, which is normal. You know, because as you chip away at it, you begin to realize how insignificant a single day of development is, and the realization that this is going to take months, if not years, to finish begins to loom over you. To help combat this, I tend to set goals for myself, and what this helps is that I don't consider a day of development under the context of my entire journey developing the project, but I'll view it relative to a week of progress or a few weeks of progress. What I've done is I've set deadlines for myself. For example, I need to finish my game by next week, and what this has forced me to do is make compromises to reach that goal. What this means is what I'm left with is everything necessary for me to call the game complete and not extra fluff which doesn't need to be there. For example, that dome sprite I made, to be honest, I'm not very proud of it. It's something I would have liked to have polished up and even meticulously shade to a degree, but I stopped myself from doing that because it's good enough. In that music I rushed for that same level, I would have loved to have spent more time refining it, but for now, it's good enough. It serves the purpose that it needs to. One important thing to note in development is that there's always time to go back and refine stuff, but sometimes, you're just not supposed to do that right away. Sometimes it's more important to prioritize what still needs to be done and get that out of the way first, and then with the remaining time, you decide what you can allocate time for. My game being playable and complete is my top priority. Only then should I begin to refine and add on to it. So, to conclude, set daily, weekly, or monthly goals which are reasonable, ensure that what you're working towards is merely the bare minimum, and any time you have afterwards should then be spent on polish and refinement dependent on prioritization. Hopefully, with this, progress for your game will feel steadier and less unrealistic. It's been a bit surreal working on Never Forgotten these past few weeks. The fact that my game is so close to completion is kinda crazy. My main goals are now just to, of course, finish it up and then refine it according to feedback from players, from which point I will then determine what I have time for leading up to release. Along the way, I have cut a lot of ideas and content from the game, some stuff which I had even spent a fair bit of time developing and implementing. But recognizing that those things were fluff and cutting them when I realized I didn't have the time to fully integrate those ideas is really important for completing a project. Alright, I've certainly rambled a fair bit, as I tend to do when talking about this sort of stuff, but the general takeaway I want you to have is, Try and keep your work focused. Don't start working towards a goal until you have established what that goal is and some general steps that you'll take towards reaching it. When building your game's mechanics and systems, look to what your inspirations are doing. Use their mechanics as a reference for how yours should operate and interact. And most importantly, find contentment with the imperfections in your work. And understand that nothing will ever be perfect or finished. You need to be able to look at your work and tell yourself that it is good enough. Alright, that's enough rambling for several videos, so let's close this out. Thanks for taking the time to watch all the way to the end of the video. I hope I was able to provide some helpful advice, or at the very least, entertain to a degree. If you want to stay up to date with development, consider subscribing and joining the Discord server, where you can also sign up to playtest the game next month. If the game looks interesting to you, consider wishlisting it on Steam to be notified of its release, and there's also a demo available containing the first act of the game. Alrighty, that's all for this week. I'll be back next week with a video about something.